Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat HaChodesh. That means that Pesach is around the corner. And if Pesach's around the corner, then you need your merchandise. Pesach is a very merchandise-rich opportunity. What are the things you need for Pesach? The things that you could maybe invest in now and keep for many, many years, not just the things like matzah that you're going to be eating. A Seder plate, absolutely. Technically, we don't kind of need a Seder plate. We could do with Seder without one. I did my first one in Japan without one. But it's nice to have a Seder plate. Everything nice and neatly displayed, preparing everything just right for the Seder. Absolutely. What else do we need? Haggadah, right? While it is true that the original form of the Haggadah was probably meant to be memorized as a skeleton, and then you would fill in the additional elements, as, for example, when we talk about the Aramean attacking my father, that was a declaration that most people would have known in the ancient world. And then, as we can see in the classic Haggadah, line by line, word by word, we can expand upon that, which makes it a very portable text to use. But it is wonderful to have a Haggadah, and there are so many beautiful Haggadot that are made with additional commentary, insights, graphics, all sorts of things. Everybody should find a Haggadah that they love, and then next year find another Haggadah that they love. It is a beautiful thing to collect and learn from. What else do we need? What? We need a cup. Right? We need a cup. Now, we need a cup both for the 4 cups of wine that we will have. Many people also have a separate cup that is set aside for Eliyahu. We'll talk about that another time. But there is also that 5th cup that sometimes will sit. And having those cups are great. Sometimes people will get matching sets for all of their guests so that we're all lifting the same kind of cup. There are many different ways we can go. Yes, technically you can use a paper cup, but it is nice to have something a little extra special for Pesach. I mean, I think about our ancestors during the first Seder in Egypt. I'm pretty sure they were not using silver cups. They probably had a clay cup and were glad to have it. Anything else that we need for our Seder? You guys are not very good shoppers. Miriam's cup. Wonderful thing to add on to our Seder. Anything else? A pillow. We don't live with reclining chairs at our tables the way they used to, and so a pillow is often needed to be added in. My mother still has the pillow that's been used at the baby namings since my brother and I, and then for his kids and my kids, and that's her pillow. It's nice to have that. Well, specifically the pillowcase. I think the interior pillow has been replaced a couple times since then. Matzah holders, right? A matzah cover, beautiful, covers to hold the 3 different sheets of matzah. There are lots of things, but if you go into your average gift shop, one of the things you will find plenty of that might be surprising are the plagues. Everybody makes merchandise out of the plagues. It's kind of macabre, but it's there. You can find masks for each of the different plagues. You can find wind-up toys for each of the different plagues. You can find edible versions of most of the different plagues. There are all sorts of different variations on the plagues. And I always find it rather odd, because when we come to that section, yes, it's kind of interesting for the kids to see them play with little symbols of death and trouble. But it also can sometimes limit us in our discussion of the plagues. See, the plagues weren't just bad stuff happened. The plagues, as they are spelled out in the Torah, are a very, very carefully orchestrated literary unit within the Torah, and not easily reducible to kitsch. It doesn't really lend itself to that kind of merchandising, and yet here we are in the 21st century. So I want to talk a little bit about that literary unit of the plagues, because there is much that we can learn by trying to understand them. Now, when I say literary unit, I mean that very, very deliberately. Maybe some of you had a good English teacher, maybe you didn't, maybe you liked studying literature, maybe you didn't. But trust me when I tell you that when you study something as a unit, recognizing that the author, in this case, capital A author, has woven together certain phrases and certain structures in a way that yield more than just the parts on their own, that the sum of the parts truly does achieve something special. But to do that, we need to see the patterns that are found throughout the plays. Has anybody ever noticed any patterns in the plagues or studied about some of the patterns in the plagues? I'm happy to take any additional insights that I may not have come across yet. Yes? Pharaoh hardening his heart. That's a pattern? Seems to happen over and over again. We're going to come back to that one, actually, because I think we need to build up to that before we could to see that particular pattern, because right now the pattern you've just stated is very incomplete, but you're on the right track. But let's get some of the other more maybe mundane patterns out of the way. So one of the very easiest ways to divide the plagues is by the warnings. If you read through the plagues very carefully, they break down into 3 groups of 3, plus the plague that strikes the firstborn. In each of the 3 groups, the first 2 plagues come with a warning, and the last plague in each of those groups comes with no warning. That is to say, Moses goes to Pharaoh, says, if you don't let us go, such and such is going to happen. Pharaoh goes, nah-uh, and then such and such happens, and then it gets removed. Second plague, again, comes with a warning, nah-uh, and then it happens. Third plague, Moses doesn't go to Pharaoh, it just happens. It's a pattern. 3 groups of 3. It is a way of showing this continual cycle, if you will, this revolving conversation between Moses and Pharaoh, and as we say still in modern English, basically going in circles. That with the warnings and without warnings, it doesn't seem to make a difference. Over and over, not just within each unit, but in the total 3 of 3s, the same pattern gets played out again. It's a dead end in the conversation. It doesn't seem to be working. It doesn't seem to be going forward. However, that's a very limited understanding of the plagues, because there are other versions that absolutely see them as going forward. Very commonly now you will see scientific breakdowns of the plagues. They only work up until around plague 6, with the idea that the Nile turning to blood was the heavy clay deposits from the upper Nile washing down, and indeed, you can still see this phenomenon occasionally, give or take Egyptian damming, that the Nile will turn to a bright red color, which becomes horrible for the animals in it, and that then would make the frogs want to leave. When the frogs leave and take refuge in the residential areas of Egypt and then begin to die, they begin to fester. When they fester, there's a multiplication of the insect swarms. The insect swarms spread disease to both animals and people. That takes us all the way through plagues 1 through 6 quite neatly. But then we get into a problem when we start talking about the hail, the locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. But in fact, that pattern still yields much that we can consider, which is to say, even if we can attribute the first 6 plagues to a so-called natural phenomenon, the heavy deposits of clay in the Nile one year, we find that for the final 4, indeed, we are seeing the finger of God, that we are seeing that these cannot be conveniently explained as though it was merely accidental. That instead there is something else, another level that is taking place here, that is revealing that there is more of a divine influence. Because you cannot explain hail or locusts by silt deposits in the river. That those do not have a causal link. There is also another way to look at the plagues, which is a gradual escalation. That when you look at the plagues, it begins with the plague of, most famously, blood, which hurts no one. Hurts no one. Yes, it's an inconvenience. They have to find new water sources and such, but basically it isn't really a catastrophe in and of itself. It's just kind of experience. And by the time we get to the 10th plague, it is actual people dying. Prior to that, there is no actual, on-the-record, definite deaths that are occurring before we get to plague number 10. We move from inconvenience of plagues of blood and frogs all the way up into things that begin to damage our property, our animals, our own bodies, making us ill but not necessarily dying, and then beginning to damage the crops, which will come with long-term consequences for the nutrition of the population. And only at the very end do we get death. That there is a gradual, steady escalation of the consequences. Indeed, fitting with the pattern already, that there were these conversations with Paro, that may have felt like they were going in circles, but they were going in circles through an escalation, and yet we were getting the same result. That is to say, Pharaoh was as dismissive of the issues with blood and frogs as he was of the hail and locusts, which were wiping out the food that was meant to feed his people. So by combining some of these literary versions, you can see that there is much to be gleaned. But let's come back to the breakdown of the plagues that actually is most prominent in the Torah itself, most clear in the Torah itself, and in fact is foreshadowed in the Torah itself. Something that is often overlooked is that we first come to Pharaoh and we express our concern that we, the Israelites, are about to be plagued. What does Moses say to Pharaoh when he first shows up in that throne room scene that's been made so famous in all the movies? Let my people go to worship God, because if we don't, and that's the part that often gets left out of the movies, Moses comes with a threat not to Pharaoh, but to the Israelites. When Moses shows up and says, let these people go so that they can go worship Adonai in the wilderness, he follows it up by saying, for if we don't, we, the Israelites, will be struck by pestilence and sword, by dever and cherev. We are the targets of plagues if we do not go serve our God, says Moses. Now, there is an implied threat that if you stand between us and serving our God, you too will be subjected to plagues, and indeed that begins to be spelled out as the dialogue between Pharaoh and Moses continues. But his opening gambit is to turn to Pharaoh and say, look, we're in danger. The Israelites are in danger. Our God is not happy that we are not worshiping him the way God wants. If we don't, we will be struck with plagues. We will be struck with pestilence, and we will be struck with the sword, which means death. Now, coming back to Deborah's earlier discussion of Pharaoh hardening his heart, if you go back through the literary structure of the plagues, something very important appears. That there's a very natural way to divide the plagues into two equal groups of 5. The first 5, which are up to pestilence, up to dever, the first 5, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. The last 5, which have as the capstone the sword, which is to say the death of the firstborn, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Now, before we get into what this can mean, I just need to take an aside, because this comes up every year and almost every Seder that I've ever been at. What do we mean when we say Pharaoh hardened his heart or God hardened his heart? I'll give you a hint. It has nothing to do with what our modern language means when we say to harden your heart. Modern English colloquial expression, hardening your heart, means that you become lacking in compassion, that you don't care about other people, that you are the Ebenezer Scrooge, stepping across others, not caring about their feelings, not caring about their suffering. And while it is true that Pharaoh exhibits those traits, that is not what to harden one's heart means in this particular idiomatic construct. It means instead to stiffen one's resolve. The heart was the seat of intellect. It was the seat of decision-making in biblical poetry. To strengthen it meant to be more committed to the position that you have. So, your guy comes and says, I want you to leave, let my people go, and you're like, no way I'm doing that. I'm not giving in. You're hardening your heart. It's not necessarily that you are being cruel. It is just that you are being focused on not letting go of your position. You will not flex. You will not bend. Your mind is made up. All right, so with that in mind, when Pharaoh hardens his heart, it becomes a little bit easier to understand the idiom. It means that Pharaoh does not yield to any of Moses' pleas, nor does he yield in the face of all of the plagues. He does not change his mind despite the suffering that is happening to his nation, despite the advice of his advisors, despite even the magician saying that this is the hand of God. he does not change his course. He is set. Now, when God begins to take over from plague number 6 onward, well, what does it mean then? Does that mean that Pharaoh was ready to change his opinion? Does that mean that Pharaoh was ready to adapt, to adjust? Well, yes and no, kind of. What it means is that Pharaoh was beginning to vacillate indeed, but he had not actually changed his opinion. His intent was still the same, to ensure that the Israelites did not leave and remained as a perpetual labor source for Egypt. This was a source of wealth, a source of his greatness. He was not going to let them leave. However, he was beginning to vacillate for compromising or stretching out the conversations regarding that. He would begin to dissemble of what his intentions truly were, because he began to realize that saying it openly put himself and his nation in further jeopardy. Pharaoh's strategy from plague number 6 onward would have been, were it not for God continuing to stiffen his resolve, to have pretended to acquiesce, to have pretended to beginning to entertain the idea that maybe the Israelites could go and worship, in order to string along Moses and the others, and thus avoid any of the additional problems that more plagues would bring. What Pharaoh would have been doing from plague 6 onward, left to his own, would have been to continue his position while publicly calling for a ceasefire. He had no intention of letting the Israelites go. He had no intention of improving their lot, their condition, or doing anything to make themselves better. He was not about to release them. He was not about to allow God to redeem them from the captivity of Egypt. But he was worried about his physical position, that it was getting hard for him and his country. So he needed to try and play the publicity game between him and Moses and God and make it look like he was agreeable to additional talks and considerations as long as God would stop with these plagues. And God was not going to play that game. God said, no, look, I know your heart. I know your intention. I know what you want. I know where your mind is still set. And all I'm going to do is just give you that nudge to say what's in your heart, to be honest, not just to yourself, but to everyone else. That you really have no intention of letting the Israelites go. Whether or not I stiffen your resolve, the only place you are vacillating is how publicly you're willing to state that you refuse to let them go. So, what I will do for the final 5, as I continue to crank up the volume, is I will give you more courage to say no to Moses and me. I will give you the strength to deny the redemption of the Israelites, because I know that is what you will do anyway. You just don't want to do it publicly because you don't want the consequences of the plagues. Now, there are questions within our tradition of whether or not that is moral. Is it right that God stiffened Pharaoh's resolve? Couldn't he have stood back and allowed Pharaoh to, well, that's where it falls apart. What would Pharaoh have done? Would he have truly done teshuvah? Would he have truly repented from what he had done without God's additional interference following the 5th plague? No. He would have continued to try and paper over the problems, try and avoid any of the issues, and certainly make no concessions and not allow the redemption to take place. So while in theory, it might have looked like God was forcing Pharaoh to dig the hole deeper for himself, all God was doing was pulling back the curtains to show that this was what Pharaoh was doing, and that there was thus no alternative except to continue the additional plagues until the redemption could finally take place. And in case you're wondering, yes, but maybe Pharaoh wouldn't have done that. Maybe he really would have changed his mind. We see him again, once the Israelites are gone, we see him again chase after, pursue, wish to even murder that which he was trying to keep. It is clear that he was not in good faith negotiations with Moses, that he was not interested in actually allowing the redemption to take place. It's hard for us because as Jews, I hope we recognize that when we engage in discussions and in controversy or negotiations with others, that we will act in good faith, that we will propose what we are willing to accept, and we expect that those that are our adversaries will do likewise. The story of the plagues is revealing that indeed there is a period up till pestilence where a person might have the opportunity to change their mind, but after that, God will continue to reveal what's in their heart up until the ultimate necessity, the sword, is needed. And this is what was unfolded in the land of Egypt, is what has continued to unfold all the way up until our current situation. That there are many that have opportunity after opportunity to change course, to recognize on their own that the position they have taken is one that is only leading to more hardship for themselves and their people. But after a certain point, after a certain tipping point, we can't simply say, oh, now they wish to have a ceasefire, now they wish to stop. When we recognize that they do not actually wish to stop, they only wish for the problems, the consequences that they have now incurred to stop, while they continue to hold on to those who should be released, and while they continue to foment new waves of violence that will come later. That is simply disingenuous. That is not what a ceasefire is meant to be. A ceasefire is meant to be a prelude to building trust until eventually there can be a proper negotiated peace. And that is not what is being called for at this time. It is frustrating because we know that we indeed would love for there to be a ceasefire that was genuine, just, and that took care of the issues that allowed the situation to begin and reach the crisis point that it is currently in. Would want nothing more than that. That would be a wonderful Pesach miracle. Unfortunately, at this stage, it is about as likely as Pharaoh changing his own heart. Does not look like that is in the cards. We will see what will unfold. I am not a Navi. I cannot predict what will happen in the coming months and weeks, or weeks and months. But we can recognize something from the story of the plagues. That not every negotiation is as simple as who is resistant to which part. Not every negotiation is as simple as if you don't, this will happen, and then it happens. There are multi-layers of meaning and understanding that have to be explored and examined. Make sure that you are looking deeply. Make sure that you are not settling for superficial ideas or talking points. And make sure that you continue to support Israel as she tries, once again, to deal with our modern version of Pharaoh that does not want to let our people go. Shabbat Shalom.